Today, we are joined by the man, the myth, the legend behind ENS, the Ethereum Name Service. Since we last chatted with Nick in 2021, he has made ENS a household name across the crypto industry and beyond. Nick and I get into the details behind the ENS roadmap, including the latest V3 announcement, what it was like for Nick to go from Google to the Ethereum Foundation to founding ENS, an inside scoop on last year's drama with Brantly, and the current culture at ENS, and so much more. But first, Nick is going to tell us the founding story of ENS and how he managed to go from Google to Ethereum to founding ENS.
I joined the Ethereum Foundation after a financial services company reached out and said, "Do you want to work for us on Ethereum?" And I went, "No, not really, but this Ethereum thing sounds interesting." Started playing around with it, started writing code. Very quickly got hired by the Ethereum Foundation, and it was a big plunge to go from comfortable, well-paid Google to the uncertainties of life as a contractor with half the salary and no real guarantees, much less time off for holidays, but a really exciting platform and product to be working on. And I very quickly started working on ENS as a side project inside the Ethereum Foundation. And that fairly quickly migrated from being my side project to my full-time project. Eventually it got to the point where it was too big for a single person to do it.
Totally amazing. And I love that risk-taking nature, such an important part of entrepreneurship. And when was that you first heard about Ethereum?
That would have been 2016.
Amazing. Okay, great. And then tell us a little bit about what it was like working inside of the Ethereum Foundation in the early days.
It was interesting. It certainly didn't feel like early days at the time. If the mainnet had been out almost a year. Everyone felt like old salts. I felt like I was joining late. But I guess everybody does, except the founders. Everyone always gets that feeling that you're late to the party. It was interesting. It was a very collaborative environment. The teams were quite small. We had some pretty remarkable things we were trying to achieve. And largely it was, I guess you'd say it was very decentralized in a way. You had close communication with your team lead, and you worked very closely as a small team, but the rest of the org was a little more sort of opaque and distant in a way. And I think that's a natural consequence of a distributed organization, and it's something really difficult to combat, where you get very familiar with the people you work with daily and you don't know anything about the people that are a little more distant from you.
Amazing. And then, as a founder, we've had many people kind of spin out their own side projects and go full time. But I imagine not everyone is so welcoming of that. And I think in crypto, generally people are. But how did the EF kind of handle that? Did you feel very supported through that move?
Yeah, they were incredibly supportive. It went really well. I had this gradual transition from part-time side projects to full-time project. And once it became clear that it was going to be more than just a one-person job, we had some internal discussions, and the foundation was experimenting with the idea of decentralizing sort of individual teams, so spinning them out into their own organizations. And they decided that the ENS would be sort of the guinea pig for this. So they said, write up a proposal for ENS as its own organization. Tell us what sort of size grant you would need. And so I sat down and I did the figures, and we already had a couple of core contributors who had been contributing on a voluntary basis. And I wanted to be able to hire them at a decent wage and make them the core of the new team. And so I came back with a figure, and it was sent all the way to Vitalik, who looked at it and went, "No, this is totally inappropriate. You need twice that." So the EF gave us a grant of $1 million to get started, and that enabled us to hire our first contributors and be hit the ground running, basically.
Amazing. I love that. Doubled the amount. That's so nice. And tell us a little bit about that core team, just maybe for listeners who don't really understand how that can emerge. If you can just talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. So right back at the beginning, it was myself, Jeff Lau, who I hired on a freelancing platform to design the first version of the ENS app front end, and who liked the job enough he stuck around and did some voluntary work. Makoto, who is our long-term developer and developer advocate and blogger and speaker and so forth. And we had a couple of other early contributors, Beltran and Chris, who were our UX expert and UI expert, who have and project manager, who have unfortunately moved on from the team since. But to start, it was just sort of four of us, and we stayed quite small for quite a long time.
Amazing. Well, that's great. And then what about any advice you have for someone who wants to follow a similar path, maybe from big tech to a protocol, but they don't know how to get started?
I would say make a conscious decision about whether you want to be a public good or whether you want to be a for-profit project. And I think a lot of people never consider that they can be anything other than a venture capital funded for-profit project. And it's not suitable for everyone, and it can be harder to attract funding or to become self-sustaining. But if your project is the right sort of project, then that's a really viable way forward, and it can lead to building something that is better for everybody, that is a more useful piece of infrastructure, a more useful platform than it would be if it was, centrally owned by venture capitalists and yourself, So first decide that, and then if you decide you're going to build a public good, think about where you can get your funding and how you're going to get started, and also what your path to sustainability is. And that might be that you continue to get grants indefinitely, but you need to be able to show real value, and you need to identify organizations who are going to be willing to support you because you're delivering something really useful that they're able to fund. It's a more difficult path than accepting investment and selling products. But I personally strongly believe that for things like naming and other basic infrastructure, we shouldn't be structuring them as for-profit companies, because we want them to serve their users that are built on top of them rather than, extracting maximum profit.
Absolutely. So talk to us a little bit about that. So you actually chose not to take any investor money. You went the grant route, and then you developed token economics around ENS. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, as I said, I strongly believe that things like ENS should be public goods. The ENS charges fees, but the primary reason for its fees isn't to generate revenue. It's because if we didn't, every single name would be snapped up instantaneously. All revenue would go to miners and excessive transaction fees, and then all of the names would be sold on the secondary market at inflated prices, and it would be difficult to impossible to find a name that represented you. So in the case of ENS, some level of fees are necessary in order to make sure that names remain available. And we're quite fortunate that that also happens to be a sustainable funding source. So we're in a really good position in that regard. But we started off by designing the incentive systems and designing the way the whole thing was structured, and only then moved on to, what can we do with the funds, basically. So initially, ENS was entirely grant funded, and in fact, the current fee system didn't come in until a couple of years into our existence. Prior to that, everything was deposit based, so there was no revenue at all. Since then, we've become self-sustaining, and then some. We're building up a sizable treasury. We're building an endowment that invests in stable sources of return in order to fund ENS in the long run. And all of that started with a couple of events. The first event was that a couple of years in, we made a planned transition from the interim system, which used a deposit-based system that didn't bring in any revenue, to a permanent system that used annual renewal fees. Based on our experience, we believed that that was the best trade-off in terms of user experience and making names available. And coincidentally, it made funds available to us that we were then able to use to make the organization self-sustaining. And initially, all of those funds went into a multi-sig, and we didn't touch them because we didn't feel we had the legitimacy to direct those funds which came from the community, to how they should be spent. And the second event was about a year ago, a little bit more, when we launched the ENS DAO. And so, as everyone will be aware, we did that by airdropping governance tokens. We used a fairly complicated sort of scheme based on, what we thought were significant metrics about your commitment to using ENS. So rather than the, naive scheme, which might have been, 1 token per year you've registered a name for instance, we looked at each account and we looked at what is the longest that they've registered a name for. So if that account had 5 names and the longest one was registered for 10 years, then the figure's 10 years. If it was the longest was 100 years, the figure's 100 years. And we capped that a bit because there was the one guy who had registered his names until the year 4000 or something, and we didn't think that he should get all the tokens. And so we used that for half the airdrop, because the insight was that people who have registered their names for a long time are showing a long-term commitment to using those names and to being involved with ENS. And the second thing we looked at was how long has that account been using ENS? So, how early did they get in effectively? Because we wanted to give more governance power to people who had had a longer commitment to ENS, who had been interested since the beginning and who had a voice in its evolution already. And so we split the airdrop in half according to those 2 metrics. And we were quite fortunate, I think. We got in right at the end of the period where you could actually get away with that sort of stuff, when airdrop farming was only sort of starting to become a real problem, and without any real hint that we were thinking about an airdrop or that it would be, beneficial to farm accounts. So we found a couple of small instances of people farming accounts, but for the most part, I think we were able to achieve our goal there pretty well. Trying it again now, I think, would be enormously difficult, and subsequent airdrops have shown that often these things are gamed quite heavily, and the people who are farming those airdrops can end up with the majority of tokens that were intended to go to community participants.
Yeah, I remember it. It was a very exciting airdrop, and it was definitely it kind of kicked off that airdrop hype moment. And I remember going to an event during that airdrop hype moment, and I asked someone, "What do you do?" And they're like, "Airdrops." I'm like, okay. But yeah, amazing. And then I guess tell me a little bit more about the token economic model around the governance token. Like, why a governance token, and then where do those fees go?
So the governance token model is very straightforward. We have a token. We use it to vote on what happens to the network in terms of governance, what happens to the fees that are collected. And so to answer your other question, all of the registration fees go directly into a wallet controlled by the DAO. Everything is handled via on-chain governance. And so fees are deposited straight into the DAO's wallet, and it can only be withdrawn via an on-chain governance decision. And the token economic model is extremely straightforward. We one token is 1 vote. A majority of votes are required to pass a proposal effectively. We didn't see any reason to complicate it unduly. There has been reasonable discussion around ways that we can continue to get high participation in governance, because there's this natural drop-off as people move on. People forget they've got the tokens, they move them to other wallets and forget to redelegate them, and so on and so forth. And whether there's ways we can encourage that to stay high. So, one example would be staking or locking tokens gets you a reward of more governance tokens, in return for showing your commitment to ENS's governance by, pointing them at a delegate or something like that. The problem is structuring something like that so that it is robust and effective and doesn't make it too easy for people to game it or to automate it in ways that sort of defeat the purpose. We want people to make a conscious decision of who they delegate their vote to, not use some automated system that delegates it to the person who built the system or something like that.
Amazing. Yeah, I think we're still kind of writing the playbook for the ideal governance. So hopefully you're helping us add to that. And I remember, I think A16Z has a chunk of the tokens. Have they been active in voting? And how did they get those tokens? Did they purchase them after that airdrop?
To the best of my knowledge, they must have. I haven't I haven't tracked it exactly, but they certainly didn't get anything from the, any allocation for the team allocation or anything like that. So it would have to have been purchased. They haven't been active, as far as I'm aware, in governance. Coinbase has both some tokens of their own, but also they act as a delegate, so a lot of people delegated tokens to them, and they've been moderately active. They've missed some votes and they've hit others, and there's a few others like that in the DAO.
Super interesting. Okay, thank you. And then kind of looking back, what would you say is the most surprising in how Ethereum has evolved since you joined, 7 years ago?
I guess one thing I learned fairly quickly is I have this sort of theorem that anything you don't constrain for when you sort of build your community is going to be something that people hold sort of all different views on. So the DAO fork is the primary example. The DAO attack was like the day after I joined the Ethereum Foundation, so that was an exciting first week. I naively thought that this would be relatively uncontroversial, and I was conclusively demonstrated to be wrong in that case. And that kind of cemented my belief that if you don't build your community with a particular goal in mind, you don't say, this is one of the ground rules, then the people who join will have all different views on what that position should be. And so it was with the DAO. There was no clearly defined, this is what Ethereum believes in. And so people took all views on it. And in some degrees, that's healthy. And in other degrees, you need to sort of make deliberate choices about where you're going to direct your community. And you can only really do that before it's formed or as it's forming. After that, it becomes extraordinarily difficult. And so the way we applied this insight for ENS is when we launched the DAO, we had an explicit ENS constitution. And the constitution is short, but it outlines what we believe are a few of the sort of basic fundamental premises that ENS believes in and tries to further. And I think that's been reasonably effective at keeping things sort of on topic and on track, and making sure that, these are the base ground rules that the community forms around, and then everything else is open to debate.
And what are those principles that you set out?
Oh, so you're going to test my memory now. There's only 4 of them, but one is that ENS is governed, it collects fees only secondarily as revenue, but primarily as a way of governing the network, like I discussed previously, and that it won't set any fees except to achieve those goals. And I'm going to just shamelessly look them up to make sure I get them all. So the first one is name ownership shall not be infringed, which says effectively no bias, no prejudice, no selectiveness in terms of how names are managed. Any name that follows the rules for registration should be valid, and it shouldn't be things shouldn't be changed based on the name. So each of these comes with examples of what's allowed and what's not. So an example of what's allowed is you could charge higher fees for shorter names, which is what we do. An example of what would not be allowed would be a list of names that are massively more expensive because whatever reason, or just can't be renewed or registered. The second one was that, as I said earlier, fees are an incentive mechanism, so they're designed to regulate the system, not for profit, but that where income is earned, it's used to further ENS and other public goods, and that's the third of the constitution clauses. And the fourth one is that ENS is sort of a good global citizen and integrates with DNS and the rest of the global ecosystem, and sort of plays well with others rather than trying to overturn the apple cart and start everything from scratch as if nobody else ever built anything interesting. And then finally, we have a clause about how to amend the Constitution.
Super interesting and very smart, I think, to set that out early days. We've followed a similar path, but there's just more around freedom of speech. And I think it is important, especially as, we're creating things that are disrupting a lot of power structures. And you really need to make sure that the people that join the ecosystem, the team, the community are there to fight that good fight when it comes down to it, which, eventually it will. And on your point of the DAO and you thinking it wouldn't be controversial, there are many people that think code is law, but in this case with Ethereum, it was such a majority of the Ethereum tokens that it probably would have stifled the potential for Ethereum in the future. But I would love to kind of hear what do you think those principles should have been for Ethereum, and why did you think it wouldn't be controversial?
Code is law has always struck me as a sort of a poorly defined thing, and I think it also misunderstands what these systems are built on, because ultimately the ground truth of every one of these systems is social consensus, and you see that whenever there's a fork. Most forks on Ethereum have been uncontroversial because the social consensus is this new version of Ethereum is the one true Ethereum. And that's such a strong consensus because, it's an uncontroversial technical upgrade that, that everyone just follows it because they believe independently that that's the right thing to do. And in some ways, I'm a big believer in forks as a decision mechanism, or at least the threat of forks as a decision mechanism, because the ultimate arbiter of which system is better is which one do people actually use. And in extremists, like we did with the DAO fork, you can actually enact that and, people can choose the network that has the rules they want. And I think that's ultimately the right way to run the system. That gets a lot more complicated and difficult now that we have DeFi, because ultimately, Chainlink and other oracles decide which chain is the real one in some practical sense, because if you fork and then all of the pegged assets go immediately to zero, you're not going to have a good time, to say the least. So, my kind of view is coder's law would tell you can never upgrade anything. You can never fix any bugs. You can never improve anything. What we've got is what we should always have. And it's kind of a, virgin birth type myth that, this is the one and ideal system. And I think it's better to say instead that, we decide, everyone independently decides what to run, and they do that, consulting with others and seeing what people use and what, what's useful to them. But that any change that enough people want to use and isn't forced on them is legitimate, which is why I think things like hard forks are a good way to enact upgrades rather than soft forks where you can effectively, the majority can enforce an upgrade on the minority.
Yeah, I probably should have prefaced with trigger warning for the hardcore Bitcoiners out there, but here we are. And I think that is the power of open source, right? Like you can vote with your feet, and that's part of the point. And I want to talk about the ENS roadmap in a bit, but before we do, let's talk a little bit about why you're passionate about decentralized naming. Why did you choose this to kind of spend such a large chunk of your life on?
I guess, I've always been interested in and passionate about internet infrastructure in general. Naming with DNS and so on interested me. Building basic infrastructure that makes other things work better has always just been something I find really engaging. I like building the stuff that underlies the other stuff. And so that's what attracted me to ENS initially. I knew that naming was an important primitive. I knew that the user experience and the way things were working with cryptocurrencies was kind of terrible. And I knew I had the expertise to do something about this. As for why I dedicated such a large part of my life to it, it's more that periodically I build things that seem cool to me, and most of them never really go anywhere, and some of them somewhat unexpectedly do, and then I keep working on them. So ENS was just the most prominent, by far, example of something like that happening to me. And I'm glad it is, because it's been a really important chapter of my life, and it's a really, and I don't mean that in the past tense, it is a really important part of my life, and it's building something I believe is legitimately useful and wanted and needed.
Amazing. Well, let's talk a little bit about the roadmap. So the ENS Name Wrapper, can you explain what that is and the purpose?
Yeah, so the ENS Name Wrapper was, as of this recording, launched a bit over a week ago. And it's Basically, it's an upgrade to how ownership of ENS names is handled, and so to its permissions structure and so forth. And essentially, the crucial thing is that it enables owners of names to enforce restrictions on what can be done with those names. And naively, you might wonder, why would you want to limit what you can do with your own name? But so much of ENS rests on the idea of non-custodial assets, on immutability, on the ability to to be trustless and to build a system where you don't have to rely on somebody else continuing to be a good actor for the security of your own systems. And that's a goal of Web3 in general. And so the name wrapper allows you to do things like take a name like, say, wallet.eth, and configure it so that you can create subdomains, but you can't modify or delete them. And the result then is that you can then sell or give away subdomains to other users, and those users will use them because they know that you can't suddenly rug them. You can't suddenly go, nope, all the wallet.eth subdomains now point to my wallet, and I get all the money that anyone was going to send you. And so that comes with expirations, and it comes with a bunch of other features, but the essential core thing is that it allows you to build systems on top of ENS, on top of your own names, that are just as trustless as ENS itself. You can set things up so that people can have resources they can rely on without having to dig into all the details of a smart contract, and without having to suppose that you or the multi-sig that represents you or some DAO will continue to behave ethically.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So I remember when I bought my ENS name, I had to go in and quickly change the addresses to make sure everything sent to me. So are you saying now that has changed, that process?
So no, not directly. Like if you buy a name off someone else, that you'll still have to make those updates. Although that said, the other upgrades we deployed with the name wrapper make all of this a lot easier, particularly when you're registering a name. You can now do everything in just 2 transactions. You can register it, you can set records, you can set up your your primary name so that it shows up in apps and so on, all just in a single transaction. In general, though, if you buy a name on secondary, for instance, you'll still have to update it. But the difference is that you can then if you bought a subdomain, you know that you can actually use that securely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then I guess with that secondary market, there was definitely a lot of hype around the decentralized domains. And I think a lot of people saw an opportunity, just like in the web, to squat on domains and sell them for high dollar amounts, which I was victim of this, but I had to get my Token.eth. And so tell us a little bit about that. How are you addressing that kind of squatter problem?
So I think, first of all, it's important to sort of draw a distinction between squatting and speculation. Squatting in my book is buying up Google.eth or Microsoft.eth or something else like that, which, trademarks are the obvious reference here, but really the key is that it has one obvious owner. If I bought up TeganKlein.eth as opposed to Tegan.eth, it would be pretty clear that I was attempting to get you specifically to buy it off me. Personally, I think squatting is something of a scourge. I don't think somebody should have to pay, somebody who just happened to get there first to be able to use a name that represents them uniquely. I don't think the person who's doing the squatting is really adding to the conversation, is improving the ecosystem. The second category is speculation, and that's more, buying wallet.eth or Tegan.eth because there's a lot of Tegans, or Nick.eth because there's even more Nicks. Any sort of name that doesn't uniquely identify one person or individual. And I think speculation is an inevitable part of any system that has sort of tradable resources. We see it in everything from, commodities to stocks to Pokemon cards. And a sensible system designs with it in mind and tries to build things so that the incentives are that things work best for the users we want to attract and we want to be part of our ecosystem. And the trade-off being that they work less well for the people who want to speculate and so on. Not that we want them, all to go away, because we know that's not practical, but basically we're going to design the system with these people in mind, not these other people, because it's not that we don't like you, but we believe that we're building a system for this group of people, and so we're going to tailor it explicitly to them. And where your interests conflict, between the two groups, we're going to prioritize that group of people. And in the case of ENS, that is sort of end users. And so that means choosing things like an annual fee rather than a one-off fee, because for me to, or for you, for instance, to pay $5 a year for Tegan.eth is not a big deal. For someone who's speculating on 500 names, paying $5 per name is a bigger deal. If we had a one-off fee, they could absorb that fee, and then they could sit on the name forever. They'd have no incentive to move them on to other people. They could always wait for that massive payday. And so those are sort of examples of where we've tried to structure the system so that it makes the system sort of better tailored to the end users we want to attract.
Amazing. Yeah, incentives really are everything. And having a common first name .eth is definitely a flex in the crypto space. So that's exciting. Nick.eth.
Meet Stater Labs, the non-custodial, multi-chain liquid staking platform that's aiming to transform the liquid staking landscape. With over 120 million in assets staked, and more than 40,000 users across 6 chains, Stater is partnered with 40+ top DeFi protocols like Aave and Balancer. Gear up for the launch of ETHX, Stater's liquid staking token on Ethereum. With a unique multi-pool architecture and tokenomics, ETHX empowers stakers everywhere with as little as 4 ETH to run a node and earn 35% more than solo staking. The best part? Stater is committed to keeping their fees low and accessible to users, charging only 10% of staking rewards, so you don't have to choose between cost and decentralization. Sign up for their ETHX alpha list today and be the first to know about 1 million in DeFi rewards.
I want to talk a little bit about your layer 2 strategy and the ability to resolve ENS off-chain. And what do we expect from the protocol in 2023? What can we look forward to? And then what have you been doing with specific layer 2 integrations like Optimism and Coinbase's Base?
So layer 2 support is pretty much the big keynote of 2023 for us. We've launched the wrapper, which has some useful features in terms of making layer 2 connections more trustless, or reducing the trust level required and the number of trusted parties. But our primary thing is around CCIP read, which we first launched, in fact, January of last year. And so this allows anyone to move names and all of their subdomains onto any external system. And so that can be an L2, it can be an external database, it can be even something like DNS for that matter. And there are no additional trust assumptions required beyond what that system itself requires. So if you move your names onto Optimism with an Optimism gateway, you don't have to rely on some CCIP relayer to be honest about what's on Optimism, because it can receive and verify the Optimism proofs just the same as as you could using a system directly. And so that's an incredibly powerful primitive, because it's agnostic as to which system it's interfacing with, and it doesn't add trust assumptions like multi-sig bridges do. So it's really powerful. This has already been in use for a while by most prominently by Coinbase, who launched CB.id and set up user profiles for every user on that. And being able to do that was essential to them being able to launch this with ENS, because setting up an on-chain profile for every single user would have been prohibitive in terms of cost because of the transaction fees. And Coinbase's strategy has been first to launch with their own database as the off-chain system, and then move to a layer 2 and actual decentralization. And that's something else that this CCIP read protocol supports. And so they've, recently they launched Base, which is, based on the Optimism code base, and they are moving everything over to that. ENS team, we're going to be focused on building official integrations. So, officially supported repositories that contain all the code needed to host your own name on something such as Optimism or another L2. as well as deployments of those repositories, the gateways that you can use without having to deploy your own. And again, the nice thing about this is you don't have to trust our gateway. The worst thing it can do is be unavailable, but if it responds, it's unable to be deceptive about its response. So you don't have to trust us to operate it accurately. And so we're focused mostly on Optimism and Arbitrum, but also on ZK Sync, and we'll continue to expand that out as we build more support.
Amazing. And on the gateway piece, is that open source where anyone can run a gateway? And then how do you kind of control quality?
So everything we build is open source. I'm a big believer in letting all your dirty laundry hang out, and so we open source our repositories as soon as we start, and often they're pretty ugly at the beginning, but I've always thought that, a lot of people obsess over what the right time to open source something is, and we have to tidy all this stuff up first. I'm like, nah, the worst you get is nobody uses it. The best you get is people come along and they're like, oh, I'll tidy this thing up for you. I'll add this feature. I'll report this bug, So yes, it's all open source. Anyone can run a gateway. The main issue with quality control is the issue around availability and latency, because some random person running it might be down a lot, it might be very slow. And fortunately, that's a choice that people can make. And because there's no data stored on the gateways, their job is to collect data and assemble proofs and so forth. You can very easily move from one to another.
Got it. Okay. And then the ability to resolve websites, I think it's called eth.link, if I'm not mistaken. Is that on the back burner, and kind of getting to when, if ever, can we type in .eth in a browser and get a web page?
Yep. So it's definitely not on the back burner. There's sort of two layers here. One is the protocol itself, which supports embedding IPFS sites in your ENS name. And that is, fully decentralized. And then there are gateways to that which enable accessing it via your web browser. So eth.link is one. That was the first one we launched ourselves in collaboration with IPFS, and they gave us a grant to help fund that. This is way back in the day. And that was subsequently taken over by Cloudflare when they launched their own, Web3 gateway service, and basically offered to host eth.link for us, which was good because it was becoming a bit of an operational distraction. The OpEx stuff was starting to consume a lot of our time. And the second gateway then is eth.limo, which is a complete from-scratch implementation by a group in the community who have built the same functionality themselves and are hosting it themselves, and they have been doing an outstanding job of running their gateway. In fact, and this is saying something, it has been more reliable than the Cloudflare-operated gateway by and large. We haven't been actively developing eth.link ourselves. It's in a fairly sort of stable state, except, of course, for the reliability component. The other aspect of this is that you can already access .eth names in certain browsers such as Brave and Opera. And if you have the MetaMask plugin installed, if you add a / at the end of the name and hit enter, MetaMask will resolve it for you to the ENS name. In terms of getting it resolving everywhere, there's a few ways that could happen, but they all are pretty speculative and far off. They involve things like getting .eth added to the root, and we're talking to various people about how that would happen, but it's a very large lift, or convincing pretty much all browsers to add it, and there would be a lot of pressure from organizations like ICANN, over that sort of variance from just accepting DNS. But rest assured, it is a medium-term priority for us, and it's something we're working on really hard.
Amazing. Yeah, that's great news. And then I remember that Cloudflare announcement, I think it was back in 2021. So is that just the gateway? And tell us a little bit about how that happened. Did Cloudflare reach out to you? Did they just spin it up themselves?
Yeah, so that was the gateway. Basically, Cloudflare launched an IPFS gateway, a Ethereum gateway for RPC services, and then also using those the ENS gateway, which is effectively the IPFS gateway, but with ENS support built in. And they did, they reached out to us about integrating ENS support, sort of directly in there. And we collaborated with them on building that, and they built their own implementation of it using Cloudflare's infrastructure rather than relying on our existing code base.
Got it. And then ENS V3, can you tell us a little bit about that? Maybe the TLDR there?
Sure, yeah. So this is something we are launching along with the name wrapper. We're giving the name wrapper sort of a week to bake on mainnet to check everything's fine and so on before we roll it out officially, but that will be very soon now, probably by the time this airs. V3 is a complete ground-up rewrite of the ENS Manager app, and it's sort of we believe it makes it a top-notch user experience in terms of Web3 apps. Its goal is to be simultaneously a complete interface to ENS, so any functionality we have should be accessible through it, but also user-friendly for most end users. So the advanced functionality that some people need to access is there, but it's not shoved in your face, and it's not a barrier to using it for the sort of applications most users care about. And so it brings a much more usable, much more user-friendly interface to ENS. And the feedback we've had so far has been outstanding.
Exciting. That is great. Well, congrats on that. We're looking forward to that launch. And then any other exciting roadmap items you want to share?
One other thing we've been working on quite heavily is DNS integration. We've had DNS integration for probably about 3 years now. But initially it was only on .xyz, and then once we rolled it out to all top-level names, it was still quite expensive to use. You had to spend a lot of gas to prove your ownership of the name. And in short, what it allows is that your ENS name doesn't have to be a .eth. It can be any DNS top-level name you can use. So our developer advocate uses Luke.computer as his ENS name. And so we've been supporting that for some time, but the gas fees have always been fairly prohibitive in terms of using it widely. And one of the things that CCIP read actually enables is the ability to do all of this gaslessly. So now instead of having to submit the transaction to claim the name, you can actually just generate a proof that you claim the name, and that can be verified at the time you resolve it in your browser, in MetaMask, your wallet, or whatnot, which removes the need to spend any gas at all and makes it possible to integrate the entirety of DNS into ENS. So we're doing a bug bounty audit for using Code Arena for the new code now, and we hope to have it rolled out definitely this quarter and hopefully in the next month to 6 weeks.
Amazing. Super exciting. And then how big is the ENS team now?
We are 17 full-timers and 1 part-timer.
Pretty lean, but then the community spans how big on the community side?
Oh, it's really hard to say. In terms of DAO sort of interaction, we have, I would say, probably a couple of dozen regular participants who are high quality contributors, and a much larger group of people who are intermittently involved. We have a large number of community contributors who make technical contributions. Another thing we're working on is changing the way names are normalized in order to enable more emoji and other names. And that's been entirely an effort by a community contributor who stepped up to do this. It's really hard to say just how big the wider community is, though. Like even on Twitter, there's this an enormous number of people who are heavily involved in ENS, both on the speculation and the usage end. And even I only catch sort of the edges of it. It feels like. Totally,
yeah, I can completely relate, and I think that's one of the exciting things about protocols and networks is that you can have tiny companies, many different companies involved in the protocols, but then communities that span hundreds of thousands, millions, and eventually billions. But that's very exciting. And yeah, for those listening, you can actually get an emoji like emojis.eth, which is exciting. I don't know if everyone knows that. And then tell us a little bit about the projects building on top of ENS? Any notable applications, and what would you say are kind of like the killer apps?
So there's some interesting ones that are emerging at the moment. I've already mentioned things that are well established like ETH.limo, but it's been interesting to see some of the new things popping up. For instance, DM3, which is a messaging protocol built on top of ENS for wallet-to-wallet messaging. There's 1w3.io, and they're building it's a little bit like the instant website builder for the decentralized web. There is niftychat.xyz, which is another wallet messaging solution built in part by one of our own team. There's org3. There's a lot of threes in a lot of these names, I'm noticing, who are building an organizational management system all built on top of ENS. And likewise, it used to be called Orca, and now I'm blanking on what it's called now, is also a pod-based hierarchy system of multi-sigs and so on that's built heavily on top of ENS names.
Yeah, it's great to see kind of some of the permissionless apps that spin up. And how do you think about competition? You mentioned open sourcing everything early days, which signals to me that you're not too concerned about the competition, but how do you think about it? And, I know there have been money grabs, but how do you kind of approach the competitive landscape?
Yeah, so there's definitely, back in the day, there was us and one or two others. There was Namecoin that came before us, and there were one or two others that sort of came along, but it was very easy to focus on what we were building, and there weren't that many, people, trying to make a buck off it. But it feels like lately there's been a new naming service every week, of varying levels of commitment and varying levels of legitimacy. But it has been interesting to single out the ones that are making legitimate technical innovations. One that comes to mind is Handshake. Their goal is to replace the DNS root. And I'm not sure I agree the way they're going about it is a good one or will work. But they have interesting technical underpinnings of building their own chain that is a decentrally managed DNS root. It's technically sound. It's a really clever approach. And I sort of, watch with interest what they're doing, although am a little dismayed about the sort of governance mess they got themselves into very quickly. And I feel like that's another example of that principle I was talking about, where if you don't constrain something at the start, people will have every opinion. And so right back at the start, they accidentally allocated they failed to reserve a name that was actually an ICANN top-level domain, and then somebody bought it on chain. So now you have the case where there's two different owners for the same name, one in ICANN, one in their system. And predictably, in hindsight, it was controversial as to what they should do. Should they have a hard fork to fix the reservation, or should they say, well, we've already diverged from the legacy internet and this is how it is? And in the end, sort of stasis won out, and they didn't do any sort of hard fork. Another example is the Nomen on Fuel, which is heavily inspired by ENS in some ways, but it's experimenting with some of the proposals that Vitalik put forward as potential fee mechanisms for ENS. So they're experimenting with a sort of demand-based pricing and so forth. Those are a couple that come to mind. It's nice to see ones pop up that have actual interesting new innovations rather than being just clones, because totally. Yes, our source is open, and often these things pop up and they're the insert name of chain here naming service, and they've taken our site and they've replaced the logos, and they've taken our code and they've replaced .eth with .whatever, and that's the extent of the innovation, Totally. And you kind of just have to roll your eyes and move on, because there's no point trying to fight it. It will rise or fall on its own merits. And if you open source stuff, you have to be prepared that this is going to happen. This is kind of the point of open sourcing things. If somebody else does what we do better than we do, then probably the world's better off with it. And I hope to avoid that by learning from them and improving ourselves.
Love that. Yeah, and the network effects are very powerful. So. And any advice you would have to maybe say an entrepreneur who's thinking about open sourcing, but kind of on the fence, not sure at what point they should do yeah, they should open source it.
Make the decision early, and if you are going to make it open source it pretty much immediately. Have really clear guidelines around what is production code, what is a release candidate, if you have a bug bounty, what's susceptible to the bug bounty, and so on. And, we've sort of learned this a bit the hard way ourselves. You want to encourage people to contribute. You also want to encourage people to find bugs, rather than exploit them. You don't want to end up in a situation where every pull request costs you $10,000 because it's treated as a bug, just because it was on the main branch. Decide sort of what's your revenue model. Why will people give you money rather than just fork the project? And often that can be things like network effects. There's endless VC wisdom on what this sort of moat can be. But I don't think it's by any means unsustainable to have an open source model and still bring in income or build a system that's sustainable. The typical example these days is open source platforms with hosted versions by the company, or open source products with paid for support and so on, SLAs and so forth.
Got it. And let's talk a little bit about numbers. How many ENS names are there? How many are active? And how much is the protocol and DAO earning, if you can share?
So we've got 2.4 million active ENS names at the moment. And over the last, let me see, what's that? Last 14 days, we've had about 15,000 renewals and nearly 20,000 new registrations. In terms of revenue and income, let me give you, sort of figures per month. It's basically what we do is we split revenue is the raw funds that come to the contracts. So if you register a name for 100 years, your 100 years worth of registration fees come in immediately as revenue. And then income, we sort of amortize that out. So if you register for 100 years, the income is spread out over 100 years. And so, with that sort of context, March, for instance, we brought in about just over 1,000 ETH in revenue worth $1.7 million US, and about 1,600 ETH in income worth about $2.6 million. This is sort of the first time that this year is the first time that our income has actually exceeded our revenue. So we've been earning more from, previously placed registrations and renewals than from new ones. And it's sort of a metric for us to keep an eye on, as to whether the system is growing rapidly or not. And that reflects, in large part, just how much of a rush the second half of last year was, with people massively registering immense numbers of names and really driving the figures up. Those sort of revenue and income figures, though, significantly exceed what we need for ENS operations. All of that goes to the DAO. ENS Labs, the organization I head that runs ENS development, has a grant of a little over $4 million a year. So, on that alone, we'd be good with a quarter's revenue or income for the year. And then on top of that, the DAO spends a similar amount of money on other efforts such as grants on building infrastructure, compensating stewards, and so on and so forth.
Amazing. Yeah, pretty remarkable numbers. It's really exciting to see. I want to shift gears and chat a little bit about the drama that went down with Brantly. I know you had to make a difficult decision in letting him go. Can you talk to us a little bit about that thought process and how you approached that situation?
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult at the time, and it hasn't really become, clearer or easier in hindsight in a way. Brantly was a valued contributor, and he did amazing things to further ENS. He also had some opinions that alienated him from a lot of people, and that were at odds with what a lot of people in the community believed. And I think the problem there was really the sort of lack of separation between his own personal views and his persona as ENS, which he had worked to build, as a personal sort of profile. And effectively, what it came down to is that a lot of people, both on the core team, in the community, and projects we integrated with, expressed very plainly to me that they weren't happy continuing to work on a project that Brantly was working on. And so I ultimately, everything else aside, my own personal views aside, had to make the decision of, what sort of community are we building, and who do I want to lose effectively? And so I made the really difficult decision to let Brantly go, because I respected the input and the opinion of all those other people who said, this is a red line for me.
Any second thoughts on how you might have handled the situation differently, kind of in hindsight?
I think the main thing I would have done would have been to take things slower, to make decisions with more time for thought. I think I'm pretty positive the end result would have been the same decisions, but it certainly led to a perception from the outside that everything was like a reflex gut instinct reaction without pause for thought. It didn't give people a chance to provide their own feedback and input before a decision was made. And so, at the time it felt like, well, I've made the decision. I know what we have to do. May as well do it and get it done with. In retrospect, I think just giving some time for people to listen and hear and talk would have made the whole thing a lot better.
And what are your thoughts kind of on cancel culture and this kind of mob-like behavior on the internet, kind of overall in hindsight, having gone through that experience?
I think, I think one of the great things about Web3 in general is voluntary participation. You can use the system you want, you can be part of the community you want, and you can withdraw your consent and your participation and so forth. And construed as cancel culture is one way of looking at it, but the other is that people are expressing this is not a community I want to be part of. And so, it gives people the ability to have an impact on the communities they're part of and direct their evolution and say what they think they should stand for. And either the people expressing those opinions leave if it's important to them, or the people they're expressing them about leave. And it's kind of very similar to the hard fork process for the blockchains in a way. I think the social consensus system is quite similar. And where I think it becomes problematic is where it becomes more bandwagony and divorced from what's actually going on, where what matters is the perception of rather than the actual facts of the situation.
Absolutely. And can you talk a little bit about the culture of ENS now? What kind of culture are you cultivating?
I really try and cultivate a culture that values openness and that values, attention to building systems that are positive sum. I feel like that comes through both in terms of the systems we build and also how we behave towards each other. I want to work somewhere, I want to build somewhere where people feel like making other people's lives better is a good thing to do, and that sort of a guiding principle is to build the system that maximizes the benefit to others rather than building the system that maximizes the revenue gained or the number of names registered or whatnot. And, so insofar as that can be applied to a company culture, I try and take the same attitude.
Amazing. And there have been a lot of new faces joining crypto and Web3. What values do you think those people that are new to the space really need to understand about kind of the core ethos of crypto?
I guess self-custody and removing the need to trust third parties and building systems that are collaborative and open and decentralized is the essential core of it. And it's surprisingly difficult, very, very difficult in some situations to build systems that don't rely on a centralized, trusted, third party who arbitrates things, who manages the system. And so when we build systems that, that don't require trust, and where we can't, we build systems where you can make the explicit choice about who you trust and with what. And the fundamental guiding light of all of this is sort of voluntarism, that you should be able to choose what systems you participate in and how you're data is used, how you interact with those systems, rather than being sort of co-opted into them.
Got it. Amazing. And the last question is just, how are you defiant?
That's a good question. I suppose I feel like I don't feel inclined to back down and accept other people's judgments of how the system I build should be built and run. And that sometimes puts me in conflict with others, but I think it's also having conviction in the things you're doing is a good thing.
Absolutely. I love that and appreciate it. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for coming on The Defiant. This was a great conversation.
My pleasure.